Good morning, all my superhuman friends. And yes, the button has been pressed. The great buttoning. What does that even mean? So random. So random, which is exactly the theme of today. Okay, before I get into the theme though, this is like the most chaotic start because I also took a big gulp of coffee right before the camera switched to me. First, I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to Aboriginal elders and peoples from other communities who may be taking part in this live stream today. Okay, so happy Sunday morning or Saturday night or whatever it is in the part of the world where you are. So many people, and a bunch of people were really early this morning too, in the chat, way before anything started. Mitchell, yes, you made it. G'day, Austin, Michael, Sion, Chip, Keen's here, Tony. Some call it fun. Ecognito, I saw earlier. Who else? Gerald, Chris. Yeah, cool. Thanks for coming along. Sorry. Through my. I should not have taken that last gulp of coffee. Trying to finish it right before the stream started. And the thing is that once I press the button and it begins like the whole intro sequence, it's all scripted. So when it throws to me and turns on my microphone and everything, it's automatic. I can't, well, I could stop it, but it just happens. Carl, Philip, Jordan. Cool. All right. So there are There have been a couple of topics that I've been wanting to cover, and obviously the assembly of the IoT Wi-Fi access point is a big one. I'm not 100% ready to do that, partly because I'm still getting stuff set up. Now, one thing that I've just done in the last couple of days is I got my overhead camera working, so I can now put stuff on the bench and work on it, and you can see it. Oh, I just saw that my mic level is too high. Sorry, I'm probably blowing out your eardrums. I'll just drop the level a bit. That should be a bit better. So the overhead camera is working. It's the camera up there. It's on slides, drawer slides mounted sideways so that I can adjust the position of the camera, and it's got zoom and all of that stuff. But the problem I have right now is that I don't have enough inputs on my ATEM Mini to run everything that I need, which means that having the video feed from the overhead camera and the video feed from the microscope, I don't have enough inputs for them. So I can do that with an external HDMI switch or something, but it's not straightforward. So there's a bit of messing around. I really need an ATEM Mini Extreme with all of the extra inputs, but that can be for a future thing, maybe, once I've financially recovered a bit from all of the stuff of setting up the new lab. So the upshot of all of that is what I'll probably do is the IoT access point assembly next week. And this week, I'm going to talk about something that is much more personal and that directly follows on from some of the conversation that kicked off last week. Last week I had my old friend Chip on the stream. He actually came here in person on camera with me, not just like a remote guest, which is really cool. And I want to set up more for doing more interviews and things in the future. And that was the first time that that we had seen each other for many, many years. And I feel okay talking about this because Chip was very open on that stream, talking about his own situation, some of the challenges that he's had, and his own autism diagnosis. So I need to be very careful with some of the things I say today, because what I'm going to be talking about is neurodivergence and ADHD in particular, and there are topics that have social stigma associated with them, And it can also be extremely personal, so people don't necessarily want things that they might be comfortable talking about in person, they don't want stuck up on a stream on YouTube for all eternity and that sort of thing. So, yeah, so I need to be a little bit careful, but Chip is okay with me mentioning this because he talked about it last week and he's here in the chat as well. So outside the box, a long flare that you see in the chat, that is Chip, who you all met last week. All right, Sion said, Sion is mocking my thing about financially recovered. Says it's going to take him about 3.5 years. For those of you who don't know, Sion is in the process of moving into a factory as well. So we are on parallel courses. Our physical environments that we're moving into are completely different. They're essentially the opposite situation. Sion is moving into a reasonably new factory, which is like totally clean, stripped out, nothing in it. I'm moving into an old factory that was full of stuff that needed to be moved out of the way and things demolished and cleaned up in order to be able to set it up the way I wanted. So there are different challenges that we're facing, and we also have slightly different objectives. But anyway, it's all good. It's fun. It's a really cool, fun project to be doing this. Now, okay, it should be pretty obvious to anyone who has been paying even the slightest bit of attention on my live streams over the last few years that my brain is not quite normal, and there is a really good reason. You can see that Steve is here. There is a really good reason that hang on, I've just noticed that it looks like oh no, I think it's okay. I was just looking at the bit rate on the stream. No, I think it's all right. There is a good reason that a squirrel became first the unofficial mascot of this stream. Oh, shiny. And then the official mascot, and then was named Steve. And then Austin created the real life Steve and sent it to me all the way from Canada. Thanks, Austin. I'm all over the place. And even if I come into a live stream with a particular topic, I tend to jump around all over the place. There might be some common theme or thread, but part of it is also interaction with you, like talking to the audience. I've got so many people in live chat. Oh, cool. Okay, so people who are in the chat, I just saw Sion said in the chat, I'm okay with you mentioning it about me, ADHD all the way. Both my kids have ASD plus ADHD plus anxiety, and yours also has ADHD. Yeah. Thanks, Sion, for talking about that, for mentioning that. So there are so many things that tie into this. The fact that we like hanging out with each other and following different, and when I say we, I mean, I'm talking about Sion, like Sion is awesome, but I'm also talking about the more general, you as in the audience, the people who watch the stream, and me, the types of topics that we cover and the randomness of it. There is a reason that people gel well and can click with other people who have similar sorts of ways of being in the world. I'm going to get back to that. So many things to jump around with today. So if anyone does feel like mentioning, I just saw that Austin also posted in the chat, ASD plus mental health plus hearing impairment on my end, quite open about my rocky life. Yeah, cool. Thanks, Austin. Now, I do not want this to be a situation where anyone feels like you need to reveal your personal circumstances, and that's not what this is about. What I'm talking about here is talking about things from my own perspective, And if any of you feel like jumping in and making comments or giving your own perspectives in the chat, that's fantastic, go for it. But I'm not here to reveal anything about anyone else, or yeah, you know what I mean. All right. Oh, I just saw another previous comment. Philip said, "Hey, I'm on the spectrum also." Yeah. So, getting back to the topic, it's been pretty obvious to probably everyone that watches these streams that I am a little bit non-linear, shall we say, in terms of the process that my brain goes through and the way that I work on things. And so, yes, all right, so many things. Now, working in tech, this is really, really common. Through most of my career, I have worked with a large number of people who have been neurodivergent in different ways. The classic is autism spectrum. Also, terminology. Now, terminology really, really sucks. I'm going to say ASD, as in autism spectrum disorder. The term disorder, I don't like that. Let's use divergence instead, or something, or difference. Autism spectrum divergence. So, because a lot of the thinking around this is changing so that it's not really considered a disorder, it is a difference. It is simply being somewhere towards an end of the bell curve. You are not statistically right in the center, you're sort of off on the curve somewhere. It's not a disorder most of the time. So, yes, I know, incognito, I could just say autistic. It's just, I wanted to bring that up, and I'm going to come back to that, I think. The whole thing about disorder versus simply difference, because that is an important thing. But that wasn't actually my main point now. My main point is that I have been surrounded by neurodivergent people for my career. And I think that's pretty common for so many people who work in tech, because a lot of the things related to things like autism or ADHD, they have characteristics, behavioral characteristics, that because they move you off that center of the bell curve and out towards an end on one of many different axes, it can be extremely beneficial in some ways. It can mean that you approach things in a way that makes you more predisposed or more able to solve certain types of problems or able to work. It means that you may not be able to work in a way that a more neurotypical person can work, but you can work in a different way, which gives you advantages. So there are both advantages and disadvantages. So I've been surrounded by and working with neurodivergent people for most of my life. And I always just assumed that there was also something a little bit unusual about my own brain. It's, as I said, it's pretty obvious. But I'd never taken the time to look into it or to go through a process of something like screening or formal assessment. So over the years, I've done different things, like I've done, multiple IQ tests and those sorts of things. So I've done that sort of screening or assessment, but I've never actually formally gone through screening for different things that like are listed in the DSM, the list of mental disorders, like the diagnostic manual. So Yeah, interesting. So Ecognito3 says, honestly, I find the normal, not normal terminology more offensive than saying autistic. Yeah, okay. And Sion said, it's not what should. Sorry, I've missed most of the chat over the last few minutes. But Sion, I just noticed, said it's not, or it should not be about what's wrong anymore, about what's different. Yeah. And this is as I mentioned earlier, this is an area that is fraught with dangers and potential offence about how it's spoken about. So, all right, where I'll get to is over where this story begins for me. I hadn't gone through formal screening or assessment. I had just always assumed my brain is a little unusual and I think about things in a different way to most people, and there are many people that do think about things in the same way I do. I'm not talking about in terms of things like opinions, having different opinions about things. It's more about approaching problems and the work environment, such as how to go about completing tasks and task prioritization, creativity, and all of those sorts of things. Not taking the straightforward approach to something, but seeing a problem or a situation and coming up with a slightly unusual route to get to a solution that later other people might say, oh, that's a good solution, but I would never have thought of that. That sort of experience. So how this all came about, talking about this topic today, was partly prompted by a conversation with a couple of friends. So there are two guys that I have known for a very long time. They're really dear friends to me, and we don't get to meet in person very often. The three of us have been friends for a very long time, and so all three of us work in tech. They have both given me permission to talk about this little anecdote, but I'm not going to mention their names. So because we don't get to meet up in person very often, we've had a three-way chat going for years. It goes back a long time, where we just regularly stay in touch and talk about different things. What we're up to, it's just like buddies hanging out and talking about whatever. And every now and then, it's rare for the three of us to be in the same city at the same time to have an opportunity to get together face to face and just have a chat about things. So particularly over the last couple of years with COVID, we've been making do with every now and then we'll jump on a three-way video call and we'll just talk about things for a while. And so we had one of those calls some weeks ago. And so we were doing the usual catch-up thing and just talking about different stuff that's going on. And one of them said, well, something interesting that happened to me is I was recently diagnosed with ADHD. And the other guy on the call said, hey, I was diagnosed with ADHD too. So one of them had been diagnosed, I think it was 6 months ago, the other one a few weeks ago, much more recently. But they had both come to they had both been going through this journey individually of discovering this about themselves. And so the chat that we were, the call that we were on, basically then really we jumped into this subject because it was like oh, you too sort of thing, where one of them would be describing something they'd discovered about themselves in relation to this and new retrospective understanding of, okay, maybe my behavior in these circumstances is because of the different way my brain works, and ADHD having an influence on things like work modes and problem solving and all of those sorts of things. And so we covered a whole lot of topics very quickly, like the default mode network and the role of balance in development of the cerebellum and how that influences your ability to context switch and all sorts of things. Henrik just threw a squirrel at me. Thanks for the €2, Henrik. Question thing is, where is your garden light project? Okay, let's park that squirrel. Henrik, the wiring is in. I'm going to address this right now because I want to get it out of the way so I can continue with my narrative. The paving around the tree in the backyard where the lighting is going, the paving immediately around it has been finished for a little while now. The paving for the path that leads to it was almost finished yesterday. Our gardener, Peter, was over and was laying bricks and all that sort of thing. So I'm going to get back to that lighting project. But at the moment it's been on hold, just waiting for all the paving to be finished and then the garden bed and things to be put in. All right, let's lay that squirrel aside. Okay. Right. Oh, a couple more comments in here. Ecognito said, by the way, both my son and daughter are autistic, and in retrospect, so are my brother and father, and a not insignificant proportion of my paternal family tree. I'm pretty sure I'm not, but I like to quip I'm not autistic, but I sometimes play one in real life. Certain sensory issues and other common comorbid conditions. Right. So, back to this conversation. So, we were on this three-way video call and talking about all these interesting things. And as the discussion was going on and talking about behaviors and modes of thinking with the retrospective knowledge of the overlay of ADHD onto those behaviors, as we're going on, the two people in the chat were like, John, are you paying attention? Are you recognizing any of this? And it was, from my point of view, it was like a whole series of, wow, that describes me exactly. I know just where that is coming from. So, so that really started me thinking. And also to give a little bit more context, my own knowledge of ADHD has been, and what it is, has been extremely limited. It's really been the cliched concept. So I think if you went out and asked random people, what is ADHD? The answer would be something like, it is something that some kids have, it makes them hyperactive, they can't concentrate in class, they run around like crazy, and they take medication and it calms them down, and then they can focus and it's okay, and then kids grow out of it. That is like the potted summary of what, if you'd asked me a while ago, what is ADHD, that's what I would have said. And I think that's kind of the perception that the majority of people have, unless they've looked into it a little bit. So that's kind of the background of where I was coming from. And turns out that little potted description is almost 100% wrong, but we can get to that later. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yen Zaha just said, I'm a psychologist and I love how destigmatizing you make this topic. Well, thank you. And for your information, with a diagnosis, one should always do an IQ test, not for the score, but to find out about strengths and weaknesses. Yeah, interesting. Yes. All right. Now, I just saw see, Sion is talking about staying on topic and the hijacking of the thread. I did actually make a couple of notes to myself, just some dot points, because going through this, I knew that I would be jumping all over the place, and I wanted to make sure that there were some certain things, if it was a story, like a movie script or something, there are story beats that you want to hit in order to convey the essence of it. And I've got a list of those story beats. Lists. I live for lists. Okay, so I'm going to get back to what is ADHD in a minute. But first, I'm going to give a little bit more context about my personal situation. So a few weeks ago, we had this video call, and the whole issue of maybe there is something more specific to investigate came up, and ADHD specifically. And for context, a bit more colour around all of this. Because of some personal circumstances that I'm going through, which I am not going to be talking about, excuse me, which I'm not going to be talking about because it involves other people, and maybe it's for the future, but definitely not for now. I have recently been seeing a psychologist. So I'd been seeing the psychologist before this video call that I'm talking about. I was already having some sessions because of this other circumstance, which in retrospect may well be tied into ADHD, but I'm not going to get into that circumstance. So I was already going along and seeing a psychologist about once a week on average. And so after this video call, next session I had with the psychologist, after I had quickly done some Googling and looked up some information and looked at some resources that were suggested to me by my friends, was I went to the psychologist and said, I've just been talking to a couple of friends who have been through this experience, and just through myself, I'm pretty sure that there is some degree of neurodivergence. I have no idea what color it is, like whether it's autism or whatever, but maybe what we should do is start looking at this. And that was like a light switch moment in the sessions with the psychologist. So the psychologist that I've been seeing is not a specialist in this area, but his partner has ADHD. So he has a very strong personal interest in it and has spent a lot of time just on his own time researching it. And so for him, it was, he had all these resources right there at his fingertips, had it all in his head, and said, oh, okay, here's a screening questionnaire, so do this. And while I was filling out this questionnaire, he was pulling up other resources to give me and saying, okay, you need to check out this and this. And it was like the jumbled pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. And a lot of the things that I'd been talking about with the psychologist in previous sessions had context and started to fall together. So in terms of my current situation, I do not currently have a formal diagnosis of ADHD. What I do have is, where I am in this process or journey is my psychologist thinks, on the basis of just his conversations with me, and also with things like the screening questionnaire that he gave me, that it is highly likely, he thinks that I probably do have ADHD. But then the process of diagnosis, like a formal diagnosis, requires, so this is probably different in different parts of the world, but in Australia, to receive a formal diagnosis, It requires a screening process with a psychiatrist, and I think it may also be possible to go through the screening process with a neuropsychologist. So a neuropsychologist in Australia is a psychologist who has additional training on the relationship between the physical structure of the brain and associated behaviours and those sorts of things. So it's kind of like a bridge between the role of a psychologist and the role of a psychiatrist. So all of what I'm talking about in this context today, you've got to keep in mind, I have no idea what I'm talking about. This is all new to me. I'm learning about it as I go, and I have not been formally diagnosed with ADHD. I suspect that going through the process, that's going to be the outcome. My guess is that that will happen, but I haven't been. Yeah. So, I've been once again ignoring the chat. Tim McMahon said, tested high on online tests but haven't gone through a formal assessment. Ecognito said there is actually a fair overlap of autism and ADHD, so it is not unusual at all for someone to be both. That's a really interesting point, which I'm going to get to in just a second. Yaz said, hey Yaz, Yaz said, in my opinion, autism and ADHD are the same, the only difference is social communications difficulties. Yeah, so the way I think about this, and this is not, this is in no way official or formal or necessarily correct. When we talk about something like autism or ADHD, what we are doing is taking a collection of characteristics and putting a label on them. The thing is that the human brain is incredibly complex. We have many different attributes, we have strengths and weaknesses, the variety is incredible. And so a brain that operates in a certain way may have great strengths in certain areas and weaknesses in others. It's like for those of you who have seen, what is it called, a spider graph? It's where, in fact, this is probably a good way to visualize it as well. So I'm just going to pull up a picture of a spider graph so that, yes, here we go, images, and okay, so I've just picked where's one? You can't really see it very clearly, but this is what I mean by a spider graph. So what we've got is a situation where there are, you can kind of see that a bit better. I don't even know what this is a chart of, a spider chart.
This might answer your question. According to Wikipedia, a child is a human.
Alexa, stop. I've got to hit mute on that. I did not ask what a child was. So this is a spider chart or a spider graph, or whatever it is. And there are a number of attributes. So there might be a particular attribute. I'm not even going to mention specific attributes. You get the idea. There are certain things about different people and their brains and the way they work where they might exhibit very strong characteristics in a certain area and very weak characteristics in a different area. So it's not a case of this specific set of characteristics is ADHD, or this specific set of characteristics is autism. It's more that brains are different, and so if you have a particular collection of characteristics that, in the case of like this spider chart that we're looking at here, you can see there's a red area here, and this one has most of its area pushed off to the right towards this axis and not so much to the left, and this one is more elongated vertically in the blue. It's more that it's not that you check all these boxes, therefore you have this thing which is in this box, and there are totally different characteristics to something else. It's all mashing and overlapping, and it's a combination of characteristics. So, as I said, I don't know anything about this. I'm a total amateur, but I think what you said is correct in that they're not, ADHD and autism are not really, they're not different things. They are, they're different weightings in different directions with many characteristics that might be the same, lots of overlap and some differences as well. Yeah, yours just said, that's why the term is neurodivergent, because there is so much overlap. Exactly. Okay. So there, and also I'm talking, so far I have only mentioned ADHD and autism. There are, just because those are the two I think that are, when I say the two, I mean the two like identified groups of characteristics that are so prevalent within the tech industry and within, yeah. Oh, you said co-occurring conditions. Right. Exactly. So, it is, just to reiterate, it's not a matter of having a checklist and saying this set of characteristics is ADHD and another checklist and this set of characteristics is autism, and them being mutually exclusive. They're not. It's all a grand melange of characteristics and traits and abilities and difficulties that contribute to the way our brains work. So that's right. What was I? I was talking about my own current situation and how I've got to this point. So I've been seeing the psychologist about it, and I'm at the point where he is putting together a list of resources so that I can then go through the process of formal assessment and diagnosis. That may take a long time. It is really difficult at the moment because over the last couple of years, mental health services in general, well, health services in general have just been totally slammed because of both the direct impacts of COVID and the indirect impacts, the result of people's changing work situations, like changing from either losing their jobs or changing from a regular work situation to work from home, which then changes family dynamics, which then puts new pressure on, which then results in mental health issues and other difficulties arising from those changing circumstances. And the result of all of these things has been a tremendous amount of pressure on the health system in general and on mental health services and practitioners in particular. So it's actually almost impossible to get into see a psychiatrist at the moment. Like waiting lists, they either just say, we are not taking any new patients, like that's it, it's impossible, or you might have to wait 6 months or 12 months to get into a psychiatrist. So my psychologist at the moment is putting together, he's looking at options, like finding available psychiatrists and seeing what can be done in terms of going through that process. Okay, so a little bit about, Mitchell just said ADHD, autism and anxiety are the main three that seem to be in the tech realm. Anxiety causes a lot of problems that can exacerbate the ADHD or autism. It's quite muddy waters from what I've seen. Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. Sion just said, the formal assessment is just a conversation with a psychiatrist specialising in this stuff. It's a 15-minute chat and then a discussion on what's next. Cool. Okay. So from what I had heard, the process of assessment could be quite extensive. But I've also heard that what can be fairly common is if you've been through a fair bit of this journey with a psychologist already, if the psychologist provides a referral to a psychiatrist with some background report, which they have to do for the context of the referral, then the psychiatrist is not starting from zero. They are starting from the pre-assessment that has been done by the psychologist, and it makes the whole thing much easier. It's almost like a cookie cutter thing of, oh yes, you've already been through all of this, you've done these assessments, you've examined this about yourself, and that all seems reasonable. So, yeah. So maybe it'll be straightforward. We will see. I'm waiting to hear from my psychologist about what that process is going to be. So, okay, getting on to what is adult ADHD. And this is an area where I have been learning very quickly over the last couple of weeks, but I still have no idea. There are so many aspects to this, and I am so new to it, and I hopefully will not stuff up my explanation, but I'll try to just describe it from the point of view of my own experience and what I've seen so far. The first thing, and I think this makes... the pre-first thing is that it is not what I described earlier about something that affects kids, makes them hyperactive and unable to pay attention, and then they grow out of it. That's not it. Those sorts of characteristics are real, and I'm not saying that that is not real, but that in itself does not encapsulate ADHD, and in particular how it affects adults. So, that was the pre-first thing. So the first thing, and this is what makes it really tricky, is that it is full of contradictory indicators. And that can be really confusing. Indicators like not being able to pay attention or maintain a linear narrative and a consistent train of thought, and instead being easily distracted, jumping around all over the place. Like, that is one indicator. Easily distractible. That's the classic concept of ADHD, of not being able to pay attention. Now I'm going to address that in a second. The contradictory indicator is extreme focus, or what's called hyperfocus. Now, anyone who has worked in tech, and in particular has worked with programmers or engineers more in general, would have come across the whole concept of flow and being hyper-focused on a task and the cost of context switching. Now, a very brief summary. Given the people I'm talking to, you are so far ahead of me, you already know where I'm going with this, but I'll give a brief summary anyway. The classic situation is a programmer who is deep in some code. They're sitting there at their computer, they've got their IDE open, they're editing code. In their brain, they have built up a big complex structure, which is the logical flow of the code, the data structures associated with it, how they all relate to each other, and it's this big complex house of cards that has so many things that you have to keep in your brain at the same time in order to be able to map the architecture of what you're working on and understand the ramifications. And it's taken you a while to get into this state where all of this is in your short-term memory, it's in your mind, you've built this image in your head of how this works, and then someone walks up to your desk and says, hey, can you tell me the login details for this server? And all of a sudden the house of cards collapses. You don't have it in your head anymore. You answer the question, you give the login details, and the person walks away. The interaction took 30 seconds. You now have 20 minutes of effort to rebuild that house of cards in your brain and to get back into the state where you are deep into the problem and actually making progress again. So the 30-second interruption just cost you 20 minutes of time. That's the classic picture of the danger of context switching for people working in highly technical fields and doing programming or more general engineering work. So I'm sure all of you are very, very familiar with that situation. You've seen that sort of thing before. And the idea that when someone is working in a flow state, you do not interrupt them. You allow their brain to stay in that state. So the point I'm getting to here is that the well-known characteristic of ADHD is being unable to focus. It's jumping around all over the place between different topics. The contradictory indicator, and when I say contradictory, I don't mean it says you don't have it, but the other indicator of ADHD is this ability to hyperfocus. It is getting into a flow state where you do one thing and you will do it for hours and hours and hours and not change your method of your focus or your you can keep that house of cards balanced in your head all day and forget to eat, forget to drink, forget to sleep, forget to go to the toilet. And that is also an indicator, well, it is often an indicator of autism. It's often an indicator of ADHD. Now that is totally contradictory. A lot of people will say that how can these two things, which are totally polar opposites, jumping around between topics versus hyper-focusing on one thing for hour after hour, how can they both be indicators of the same underlying, I was going to use the word condition. I'm trying to be a little bit careful about my terminology here. But how can they both be indicators of ADHD, indicators of the same thing? And that is because the underlying cause of both of those modes of thinking are the same. One thing that I've heard a number of people say is that ADHD is not about not having the ability to focus. It's about not having the ability to regulate your focus. It's about not being able to control it. So your focus might be jumping around all over the place and you can't settle on one thing. Or your focus might be on one thing and you can't break that focus. You're really, really hyper-focused on what you're doing and your brain will not switch modes. It just stays in that state. Both of those things, even though they're contradictory, are indicators of a decreased ability to control where focus is directed. And I think that is a really critical thing. So, and it can manifest itself in different ways in different people. And perhaps this is once again, as sorry, hang on. I've got to hit mute just for a second. If I can find this button. There. Okay, I think that's better. Keen just said, is it okay that I'm reading emails and EEV blog forum while listening to this? Oh, that's classic. Yes, that's okay, Keen. I forgive you. You don't have to pay full attention to me. So this is one of the things that makes understanding what ADHD is so confusing. It's not one thing. There are many axes, and it's possible for someone to exhibit traits at both sides of those axes. Then perhaps it is that when more in childhood ADHD, more of the lack of settling is prevalent. So kids who fit the characteristics that you would think of as classic ADHD can't focus, they jump around between things because their brain is not able to regulate their focus. And then as they grow up, perhaps they develop more of the ability to hyperfocus and things change. So adult ADHD can represent itself in very different ways to childhood ADHD for a number of reasons, many reasons, so many things. Right. Austin, interesting. Okay, so Austin says, I sleep like crap, but when working in a restaurant, I can put headphones on with decent volume and nap like nothing. Yeah, so sleep issues are also another characteristic of ADHD. I've heard this, and this is one of those situations where it's getting back to the whole spider graph thing earlier of different axes and different attributes or characteristics have different strengths in different people. And for me, I have no trouble sleeping. I don't sleep unnecessarily long. How long do I sleep? I average probably 7 hours a night, give or take. Sometimes a little more, sometimes less, but it's in that ballpark. And I can typically go to sleep like turning off a switch. If I go to bed and it is time to sleep, I can get into bed, close my eyes, and like literally a minute later, I will be asleep. It's just like, turn off the switch. And then at the other end, it's time to wake up, turn on the switch. But I know that many people with ADHD have sleeping problems as well. And this is something that I really don't know. I know less than nothing about this, so I'm not really going to talk about this much more. But this is just an example of different people have these attributes in different strengths. And so that classic characteristic of having difficulty sleeping or needing to have some kind of external stimulus, like having music on in order to be able to sleep, that is one of the indicators of ADHD as well, as I understand. Yeah. So, okay. That's right, I was on the subject of what is adult ADHD and contradictory indicators. So this is what makes it confusing. There are so many of these contradictory indicators. Just about all of the axes or indicators or behaviors that are associated with ADHD have these two polar opposites. And people might be strong in one, strong in the other, or in both. It's about diverging from the average. Now, one thing I talked about earlier, I was going to talk about it at this point, but it probably doesn't really matter. I've already mentioned it. Okay, I'll mention it again. It's worth emphasizing, I think. To me, it is not about a disorder. It is about a difference. So this is probably a good time to talk about my own reaction to this as well. To many people, if you said to them, you have ADHD, their reaction would be very negative. They'd push back against it, be annoyed at themselves, I suppose, or frustrated, or want to fix it. And I think that's a natural reaction for many people. For myself, I don't see it, how do I put this? I don't see it as a problem. I see it as greater insight and understanding of myself, and therefore an opportunity to be able to to be more effective and to, I was going to say to do more good. That's not quite the right way of putting it. It's about for me so far at least, it has been about those light bulb moments of realizing things about myself and having some context for them, and retrospectively understanding why I have developed certain habits or patterns of behavior or ways of being effective. And now that I know this, I can embrace it and potentially take it even further. So that was a terrible way of putting it. I'll try to explain. No, all of my life, I have made allowances either made allowances for myself or fought my natural characteristics in order to try to fit in. Now, I'm going to get to masking in a minute, which is a big topic in itself. What I realized, so totally independently of all of this, quite some years ago, I came to this point where I started thinking, why am I fighting my natural tendencies? Why am I trying to do things in a way that doesn't come naturally to me? Instead of doing that, what I should be doing is looking at the areas that I am strong in and that I can be effective in, and then maximize that. And the thing is that the whole way this lab is set up, like if everything around behind me, okay, in fact, in the field of view right now, there is a classic indicator. There was one of the questions that my psychologist asked me when we were talking about characteristics was, do you lose things? You know, it's the classic story of, I can't find my car keys and I don't know if I did this and where did I put that, you know, and my initial gut reaction was to say, no, I don't have a problem with losing things. I know where everything is. Like, I can reach out and grab tools and I know where they are. And then as I was thinking about it more, I realized that the reason I can do that is that over many, many years, I have built these workarounds for myself and for my own brain. And what you see here with these, see that little mark on the box right there, and just there, and just there, and that one there. These are little indicators on the boxes, which are Aruco markers, which are like, they're kind of like 2D barcodes, so that a camera system can scan the shelves of my lab and work out the coordinates of all of the boxes. And if I want to know where something is, my computer can tell me where it is. So I can shove a box on a random shelf and then not pay any attention to where I put it, and then I can just ask for it and the computer knows where it is. So I can't lose boxes. So, and I described this system to my psychologist and he just fell off his chair. It was, okay, this is an extreme example of having a situation where your brain doesn't quite work in the common way. Like I am more prone to losing things, but over the years I have put systems like this in place which work around that limitation of my brain. And so this is a really good example of one of those light bulb moments and one of those realizations that I work in a certain way, and then I have molded my world and modified the world around me to accommodate those differences and to allow me to be effective, and in this case to not lose things. So Oh, and Tassie Bob said, if I did that, I'd have to put one of those codes on every side because knowing me, I'd put it on the shelf 180 degrees rotated. Yes, every one of those boxes is labelled identically on both ends. I've already got you covered, Tassie Bob. Yours just said, you will start unpacking all the strategies you have in place. Yeah, exactly. So the last couple of weeks, as I've been going through all of this, I have been paying attention to myself, to my own behaviours and habits and the ways that I put things in place, and retrospectively beginning to understand that so much of the world that I have created around me is scaffolding to support my brain and allow me to be effective in ways that otherwise might be a problem for me. Yeah. So, Mitchell said, I think another way to put it is there is so much stuff going on in our brains that where something has a lower priority than other things, and thus the location of something isn't important. Forget. Yeah. Okay. So another thing that I've been conscious of that I do over the years is like having a filter in my brain in relation to memory. And memory issues are also something that is often strongly associated with ADHD. And something that I have been quite conscious of, and my family has been quite conscious of over the years, is that someone can tell me something, and if my brain does not designate that thing as important, 10 seconds later, I've got no idea what it was. But if it designates it as important, I'll remember it. I can remember certain things and I don't remember other things at all. And I kind of think of it as being like not really, well, kind of like a firewall for my brain. So there is all this information coming into it. People are telling me things, I'm reading things, I'm getting different bits of information from different sources. And in order to protect my own brain, my own thought processes, my memory capacity, there is this very early stage firewall where the information comes in through my ears, through my eyes or whatever, and it's almost like it never even hits my brain. It's just, I have blindness to that thing because the firewall has designated it as not important, and therefore it's gone. Other things, if I designate them as important and I pay attention, then I will know them, I'll understand them. Yes. Yes. Yours said, we look functional because of how we've created our environment, but there is nothing functional about stickers on all sides of the boxes. Yeah, and Dodgy says, John, that is not that unusual. I need to have the spoons in the drawer in the same direction to feel like it is organized. Otherwise, it doesn't feel right. Right, okay. That pulls in a really interesting thing, which is OCD. And so I definitely have characteristics of OCD. And this is another one of those things where in retrospect, I actually did a conference talk in Brisbane many years ago called Use the Force, Linus, where I was talking about environmental modifications. The whole point of that talk, and it's kind of pulling it back into home automation, the whole point of that talk was about having our environment mold to us rather than the other way around. And how in the ultimate automated environment, lights should be on when you need them and off when you don't. Doors should be locked when you're not walking through it, and unlocked when you want to walk through it. All of those sorts of accommodations where the world conforms or adjusts itself to what your particular task or objective is at the time. And at the start of that talk, I actually began that talk with a photo of inside my dishwasher with all of the spoons and forks and things lined up and all grouped. And the logic goes that it is faster to pre-sort as things are being put into the dishwasher than it is to post-sort. Because what you can do when the dishwasher is finished is you grab a handful of spoons, put them in the spoon section, grab a handful of knives, put them in the knives section in the drawer. And if you do the math on pre-sort versus post-sort, it's faster to pre-sort than to post-sort. So there are all sorts of things like that, which, so I definitely have OCD characteristics. And that can be, what's the term for it? Co-concurrent or whatever. So, Joel just said, I put a wrong colour fork in my friend's drawer when I was helping him clean up. I'm no longer allowed to help clean up. Yep. Yeah, and Yaz said, this kind of OCD you're describing is an autistic trait. Yes, co-occurring. Thank you. Comorbid. I don't really like, yes, comorbid I know is the, is one of the medical terms for it, but I don't like the idea of comorbid because of course morbid is death and it's a bad thing. It's not like two bad things that happen together. It's just two things that occur together. So I prefer the term that yours said, which is co-occurring. Yes. Yeah, Incognito said, I don't like it either, which is why I put it in quotes. Yeah, but that is the terminology that is used in a lot of medical contexts. All right, so, okay, getting myself back on task just for a moment. Where are we at? We're at just after 11, so I've been going for a bit over an hour. Okay, so other things, other interesting things. Let's just get into some interesting things for a moment about neurodivergence and ADHD and some of the things I've been learning about just recently. One is the default mode network, and the task positive network. Our brains are complex. They are a very big jumble of neurons. There are electrical signals flying around all over the place. And your brain can operate in many different modes. It has different parts of the brain that undertake different tasks. You can kind of think of it as being like, yeah. So the brain is not a single amorphous mass. It's a bag of salt water. I've heard the brain described as a bag of salt water that was somehow tricked into thinking by firing electrical signals into it, which is a pretty cool description. But there are certain parts of the brain. You can kind of think of it in some ways like the architecture of a computer. You can, on a computer, you'll have the motherboard and you'll have a CPU, but the CPU is not where all of the processing goes, because there will also be things like a graphics card which has another processor in it which is used for dedicated tasks, and it's much faster at those tasks than the main processor, but it can't do tasks that the main processor does. So it's a complex system of subsystems. And so in terms of thinking and some of the modes that our brain can be in, there is the default mode network, and that is when your brain is at, you can think of it as being at idle. It is not specifically engaged in a task. It is just, it's meandering along and looking at different things, taking in different stimuli, and it is following threads of things. So it's the mode that you can be in when you're at rest. You're not necessarily trying to achieve anything. So the default mode network. And then there is the task positive network. And that is when your brain is in a mode where you are focused on a specific task and you are getting the little bursts of oxytocin and all of those sorts of things, the positive feedback, I'll get back into that in a minute, from succeeding at a particular task. It is when you are working on something, you are getting into it. Now, I was talking earlier about the difference between jumping around between different tasks and being hyper-focused. And as I understand it, still very, very limited, as I keep saying, this is all new to me, I'm just learning about it. One of the difficulties, or one of the characteristics of ADHD is the switch between those two modes, so the two networks, the default mode network and the task positive network, is not working properly. And so you might be trying to focus on a task in the task positive network and get something done, but the default mode network is still running and it's still intruding, and it is saying, hey, squirrel, and trying to grab your attention when you're also trying to focus on achieving a certain task. So, as I understand it, this is one of the reasons that things like stimming can be effective. So stimming is when you have someone with ADHD who might be doing something like fiddling with a toy and fidget spinner. It's the classic thing. Or they might be agitatedly moving their leg, or tapping or something like that. What's happening in that sort of situation is that your brain is engaged in the task positive network and you are trying to get something done, but the default mode network is also firing, and it is destabilizing and distracting because it's still jumping around in all of this daydreamy sort of stuff. Having the extra input, the sensory input from fiddling, keeps the default mode network busy and keeps it distracted and not stopping you from being in the task positive network and being productive. So that was a terrible description, and I'm sure that there are lots of people shouting at me and saying that is totally wrong. But as I understand it, that is one of the reasons that it can be helpful to do things like fiddle with something while trying to get a task done. And to an outsider, it might seem really strange. It might seem like, why are you distracting yourself by doing this thing, or listening to music? So that's another classic. It's when you want to be able to focus on a task, so you put on music, or play a podcast, or have a video going in the background, or just have the TV on in the background. That is a classic example where, to most people, that would look like you were distracting yourself. But in fact, what you are doing is keeping your default mode network occupied by just buzzing around with random things and dealing with that external stimulus, while your task positive network is focused on the task that you are doing, and then you can get on with being productive. So, okay. Right, so masking. I'm going to get to masking in a minute, but I just saw Dodgy made a comment saying most people would think that I'm an extrovert, but I'm not. I just act like one. Yeah, I'm the same. So, right. I'm going to get to masking. It is a really important topic. I've got so much more to talk about, and it's 11:15. So I'm going to try to keep moving. Okay. Other little things. This is one area that seems to me, it doesn't feel right, but there is supposedly a good basis for it. And that is the role of the cerebellum and and balance and physical exercise in relation to ADHD and your brain's ability to switch between the default mode network and the task positive network. So the cerebellum is a part of your brain that I suppose one way to think of it, it's like the graphics card in your computer. Not that it's specifically related to graphics or visual stuff. That's not what I mean. It is a specialized part of the brain which is extremely good at certain types of tasks. It is incredibly fast. And so by taking tasks that would normally be done elsewhere in the brain and having them executed in the cerebellum, they can be done far more efficiently and far faster than they would otherwise occur. So you can think of it kind of like you've got a task to be done on your computer. You can run this algorithm on the main processor, and yes, it'll do it, but it's going to take a while. Or you can take that task and put it in a specialized subsystem like a graphics processor, and because that part of the computer is optimized for that task, it'll do it thousands of times faster and more efficiently. That's what the cerebellum is like in the brain. It's part of the brain that is very good at certain things. And one of the things, this is the part that to me seems like total bullshit, but supposedly there is lots of evidence to support it. One, because the cerebellum deals with a lot of autonomic or semi-autonomic tasks like physical balance. When you learn to ride a bike, if you had to think about what you do with the handlebars in order to balance, you could never ride the bike because your conscious brain is not fast enough to process it. It won't be able to process the stimulus input fast enough to say, oh, I'm starting to lean in this direction, I'm overbalancing this way, therefore I need to turn the handlebars this way to counteract that and bring the balance back online. We wouldn't be able to ride bikes if it wasn't for the cerebellum. What the cerebellum does is take those conscious or learned techniques and encode them in a highly optimized, very quick, very fast pathway, which can be executed on demand. So then when you ride a bike, and this is the whole classic saying of once you've learned to ride a bike, you can always ride a bike. It's because the pathway for responding to that external stimulus has been set in the cerebellum and you've got it. You've created that highly optimized subroutine in your brain that can handle that task. So when that task comes along, it gets thrown to that highly optimized subroutine and bang, it gets done. Now, if you don't ride a bike for 20 years and then you jump on a bike again, you might be a little bit wobbly initially, but it will only take moments before those pathways kick in again and that learned ability comes back and then you can do it. I've just noticed that a couple of people have mentioned masking. That is a really important thing. I am going to get to that, I promise. It is on my list of things. So the role of the cerebellum. Now, this is the crazy bit. The cerebellum is very important in terms of controlling the ability to switch between the default mode network and the task positive network. Having those different modes of operation in your brain. So one of the things that has been seen in a number of studies is that strengthening the cerebellum in general by doing tasks that require balance, and this is partly why I was talking about the bike example, can then help its ability to regulate focus and attention and to be switching between those different modes of thought. So this is the thing that sounds crazy. By practicing balancing, I'm talking physical balancing, you can get better at regulating your ability to focus on tasks. Now, I came across this in a book called ADHD 2.0, which is the book that I mentioned on the stream last week. And anecdotally, talking to a couple of people since then, it seems that they have also seen similar things. So people with ADHD may find that undertaking tasks like literally bike riding will improve their fitness and improve the function of the cerebellum, improve balance, and therefore improve their ability to focus or to guide their focus and to be functioning in the right way, the right state of mind. Yes, so, okay. Oxytocin. Now, I probably won't get into this very much because I do want to get to masking. It's important. And one thing that I've read a bit about is that, so oxytocin being the thing in your brain that is like the part of the reward center and gives pleasure from different things. One of the issues for people with ADHD is having fewer receptors in the brain for oxytocin. And so what that means is more of a tendency to chase behavior that creates that positive feedback and generates the oxytocin. So what it can lead to are things like being more likely to lead to things like addiction. So things like drug addiction, in order to chase the oxytocin that is not being received in other ways. So this ties into, this is a big important topic, but I don't really know all that much about it. It's where people engage in risky behavior. If I think back about some of the things I've done in my life, I've been so lucky to have got away with things. I've done things in my life that in retrospect, and everybody has. This is the thing. Okay, I'm not going to chase that squirrel. I'll get back to the topic, which is risky behaviors. My initial reflex, just like my reflex when my psychologist asked me, do you lose things? My reflex is no. If people ask me, do you undertake risky behaviors? My reflex answer is no. But in retrospect, yes, I do. And this manifests itself in many ways. There is literally risky behavior. Like here is a classic. There are so many things that I've done over the years that I really shouldn't talk about publicly because I would probably literally get in trouble for them. Like just straight up illegal stuff. But okay, the example that I would use. I used to be into rock climbing a lot. Used to go to Mount Arapiles and the Grampians and various other places. There were a bunch of my friends who were also into rock climbing. And so a predisposition to undertaking, hang on a second. Sorry, a predisposition to undertaking, okay, I'm going to crack open the can. I'm going to need this as I get towards the end of this 2 hours of talking. Austin hit on it, starting your own business. Yes, so people who have ADHD or who have this lack or decrease in oxytocin receptors in the brain undertake all sorts of activities, including starting your own business, which I have been known to do. Yeah, there are many different things that that this manifests itself as. So back to this rock climbing story. A few friends and I went to Mount Arapiles, which is in central Victoria. It's a place that's very well known for rock climbing. It's like a big escarpment that sticks up out of the ground, really dramatic, and there are some really big climbs there, all sorts of difficulties. ranging from easy to ridiculously hard. So I've been there many times, used to go camping. It takes quite a few hours to get there, so it's not the sort of place that you would typically go for a day trip from Melbourne. You would go there, camp for a couple of days, climb every day, and then drive home again. Anyway, I went there on a trip with a few friends. I'm trying to think of when this happened. It must have been in my very early 20s, because we were all driving and, you know, often having independent lives. We weren't teenagers anymore, but we weren't really, you know, we weren't fully into the adult mode of life. And there was one climb that we decided that we wanted to do. And so I was with a couple of other people. I think there were 3 or 4 of us. And there was one really long climb. I can't remember how high it is. It was probably like 160 vertical meters, something in that region. And so one of my friends started off, and in rock climbing you typically have a person who is the lead climber. They have the rope below them, and what they do is attach what's called protection to the rock, and that might be little chocks that go into a crack, or it might be expanding cams that go in and you clip on as you go. So you start off with a belt full of all of your gear, start at the bottom, and as you go up you attach these fixtures to the rock, and you use up the gear that you're carrying. So you have to go up prepared with the gear that you think you're going to need for the climb. The person at the bottom is holding the rope, so that if you fall, you will fall the distance you are above your last piece of protection, below the protection plus stretch on the rope. So if you put a clip into a rock, you climb 2 meters above it, and then you fall, you will fall 2 meters and then another 2 meters as the rope becomes tight, and then a bit of stretch. So you'll end up falling like 5 meters. And so what happened in this particular situation was the lead climber was going up, and I kind of got bored and I started climbing. Like, I was not clipped in or anything. I was not carrying any gear. My other friend was belaying at the bottom, and so my other friend was up ahead of me, and I just started climbing up behind him. No protection, free climbing, soloing. And I got up the rock a bit, and I got to where he'd clipped some protection into the rock. He already had multiple pieces of protection in the rock above me. I unclipped his gear and put it on my own sling, and then kept climbing. So as he was climbing, I was removing his protection below him and leaving the last few pieces in above. So if he fell, he still had protection, but his gear had been removed below him. And we got up to the top of that first pitch. So section, when you're rock climbing, it's called pitches. You have a pitch where you get to a certain point where you then tie off, etc., and then the next person comes up to join you. So we got to the top of the first pitch, and he was there, tied off, and I came up the cliff, and I handed him all his gear back because I'd pulled it all out of the rock as I climbed up. And all this time, I was totally unprotected. I was doing this climbing with no rope attached to me at all. Totally risky behavior. And we basically repeated that process, going up the rock. I did the entire climb with 0 protection, one little slip, and I would have been dead. So that is just one little minor story, that if I look back over my life, there are certain things like that I have done that in retrospect I think, holy crap, what was going through my head? Why did I do that? But I did it. So, risky behavior. Okay. Right. Where was I? Yeah, so my point was that people who have decreased oxytocin receptors in the brain often undertake this sort of behavior in order to increase the amount of oxytocin that is produced and receive the same sort of pleasure reward in the brain that that other people would get from much more normal sorts of behavior. And as I think it was Mitchell, or it might have been Austin, said earlier, one of those behaviors is starting a business. The idea of taking the risk to trust yourself, to go out on the limb, to go climbing without a rope and start your own business, that sort of thing is classic ADHD behavior. It's taking what you feel is a calculated risk. It is an assessment of what is something that I can undertake that is going to give me the reward that I want with a suitable level of risk. And so something that I've just recently been learning is that among people who start their own businesses, there is a disproportionate representation of ADHD. It is because of this, oh, I want to do something new, that then leads people down that path. Yes. All right. Where am I? Okay, so oxytocin receptors. That's right. So risky behavior and doing different interesting things, trying to do new things because they are interesting, is part of the way that is a sort of behavior that then allows our brains to reward ourselves. So, okay, another thing I've learned about myself. Hooray! We're all learning. Okay, and now masking. This is something that has been like a repeated revelation over the last few weeks. Once I read about masking, once again, I'm going to do a terrible job of describing this. Masking, it's the very crude way of putting it is acting. It is behaving in a certain way to be socially acceptable. And I've begun to, because I'm paying attention to this, I have realized that there are so many ways in which I mask in order to fit in with society and match social expectations. And it's draining and leads to all sorts of side effects in relationships, which I'll get to in just a second. I'll give so an example. Many people who have autism, so one of the characteristics, this is just one of those many axes, is, it's going to seem like a cliched example, but I think it's a really good way of understanding this. Eye contact. When people are in a social situation, there is a certain amount of eye contact which is normal to maintain. If you are talking to someone, it is usual to look into their eyes most of the time, to look away briefly at different times. And so that sort of interaction or that particular thing does not come naturally for many people, particularly people either with ADHD or autism. And so it is one of those things where it does not come automatically, so it requires conscious thought. And so this is the cliched concept of people with autism, for example, will either not make eye contact at all, like when you're talking to them, they'll be just constantly looking away, or they will just sit there and stare straight into your eyes and never break the gaze. And that can be very disconcerting. And so because people who have difficulty with regulating their gaze, or it just doesn't come naturally to them, right from childhood, learn to regulate that at a conscious level. And for example, when talking to someone, to be aware consciously of, I need to keep looking at their eyes, and then I need to glance away occasionally to break the gaze so that it doesn't become overbearing or creepy. And that process of, to most people, it sounds silly. It sounds like, why do you even have to think about how long you are looking into someone's eyes when you're talking to them? It just happens. But if that does not happen automatically, you have to consciously maintain that social construct. You have to maintain that behavior. It becomes a conscious burden because you are thinking, okay, I've been looking into their eyes for a little bit too long, so I better glance away. I've got to break the gaze. I've got to just look across the room for a moment and then look back again, and it's going to feel natural to them. But in your own head, you're thinking about it. You are doing this calculation of how much time should I be spending looking into their eyes instead of having the conversation and having everything else come naturally. Now, I'm kind of belaboring this point a little bit. I'm using this one example. There are many, many different types of masking behavior, but this is a good one to get to explain it and to get an understanding of it. So, why does that matter? Why it matters is that it is an extra labor that your brain is doing in addition to everything else. Instead of it simply happening automatically, it is an extra little part of your brain that is diverted to managing this process of what percentage of the time am I spending looking into the person's eyes when I'm talking to them. And that is taking your energy, your attention, it is sucking away from you. And so that is one example of masking where you are changing your behavior, like you are consciously changing your behavior, or you have learned without really being aware of it to change your behavior in order to fit in social situations and to meet social expectations. Now, learn from childhood, and with a number of these things, not just eye contact, I'm using that as one example, but with a number of these things added onto your brain as extra cognitive burden, it becomes tiring. And it means that a lot of the time in interactions with people and with relationships and the way that we present ourselves to the world, it is not really showing us as our true selves and in a relaxed way. So that leads me on to, I think I'm actually going to kind of cover everything on time. I didn't think I would. So that leads me on to another really interesting area, which is relationships. So what I've been talking about now is social acceptance and behavior in social settings. Now, relationships. What can happen is that masking and this feeling of needing to behave in a certain way to be socially acceptable can lead to feeling like you are always acting and you are not really being yourself. You are not being honest. You are not being honestly yourself with other people, which can be a really difficult thing. So it means that as you go through life, you can feel, and the thing is that this is not specifically an ADHD thing or an autism thing or whatever, this can also just be a general thing. You can feel like a fraud, you can feel like other people don't really know you, or if you revealed yourself to them, there can be this fear that if you reveal yourself properly, then you won't be accepted. And that sort of feeling can also lead to all sorts of things. Some of the things I was talking about earlier, like It can lead to depression and anxiety and a predilection to or predisposition to substance abuse and all of that sort of thing. So, okay, relationships. There is so coming back to where I started this whole live stream and talking about these two friends of mine. It's one of those things where now knowing this, I begin to see some of the reasons that I get along so well with some people, and it is a feeling of being able to relax and be honest with them. And why it feels like things, life in general is such hard work with other people because it feels like I can't be honest and relax with them because I feel like I would be judged or not accepted if they really knew who I was. So one of the things I've just been reading about as well is relationships, both friendship level and like romantic level relationships between people who are neurodiverse, and the difference between that and the relationship with someone who is not neurodiverse. I know I'm getting into difficulties of terminology here. I'm trying to be careful about it. It's not a binary thing. It's not an excuse. It's not lots of things. But there is that feeling where there are certain people that when you're with them, you feel like you can relax and be yourself. It's like this weight is lifted and you go, it doesn't matter if I stare, or it doesn't matter if I don't ever meet their eye. It doesn't matter if I do this other behavior, because they accept me and they understand how I'm getting tongue-tied here. It's not necessarily that they are the same. It's more that there is this acceptance of difference and a feeling that you can really be yourself, and you can turn off or relax the mask and the behaviors that allow you to present yourself publicly in a socially acceptable way and to really be yourself. And so there is the classic thing where there might be a couple, for example, who are both neurodiverse. They both have different characteristics to, they're different in similar ways to some extent, and they get along like a house on fire. They might be the sort of couple that other people will say, oh, they're a bit crazy, but they get along with each other because there is this acceptance and the ability to remove that mask and to be themselves with each other. And conversely, there can be the difficulties in relationships where one person in a partnership might feel like they have to maintain that mask, otherwise they won't necessarily be accepted. And so they'll go through years and years of a relationship feeling like they've been acting the whole time and not really having the opportunity to be themselves. Yes. Yeah, okay. Where am I going with this? I don't know. So much of this comes down to relationships. It's not it's not healthy or ideal to exist in a vacuum. We all need contact. We all need interaction with other people. There is so much value and so much that we get from recognition of ourselves by other people. The feeling of value that we get ourselves, and I'm kind of wandering off here because I don't even know really what I'm trying to say, and I think you get what I'm trying to say. This whole thing about masking and it's like masking behavior very, very strongly ties into the way that we relate to other people. Now, I know to some extent everyone feels like they are acting, and everyone has this feeling that I need to keep parts of myself secret and hide them away. You know, we all have those sorts of demons to deal with. But just from the little bit that I've learned, it seems that people who are neurodivergent have that to a greater extent. And so there is this feeling that it is hard to be vulnerable with other people, because if I reveal myself, then I'm not going to be accepted, because what I am may not be what they expect. I may have different ways of thinking about things, or even if we don't have different values, it'll just be different approaches to things or different physical behaviors. So there's this feeling of always being on guard around most people. But then when you are with someone who may have similar characteristics, or is just someone who is obviously very accepting, there is that feeling of being able to be open and vulnerable with them, and to relax and to enjoy things and to not hold back in certain ways. Yes. Okay. All right, so I'm just glancing back at the chat. I've done the usual thing where I have not read probably 99% of the chat. I've occasionally just glanced down and picked out little things. Notice things as they have gone by. So I apologize to everybody that has put things into the chat that I haven't noticed or that I haven't responded to. It's not that I am deliberately ignoring you, it's just that it's very difficult for me to sit here and talk to camera, talk to you, and maintain a consistent train of thought and some kind of a linear narrative, while also having this constant stream of the chat flashing by in the corner. Okay. Thanks, Pancake. Pancake said you're doing great, John. You're awesome, Pancake. I haven't seen you for so long. I think that's because, well, it's mostly just because I haven't been to the hackerspace for so long. But Andrew, you really should come out and visit me sometime at the lab. It would be cool. I'm really looking forward to this. There are so many people who I have not really had much of a chance to meet up with in person over the years, the last couple of years in particular. But now that I have this space, the Super Lab, it's going to be great having people coming in. So different to having my workshop in the back of the house, and the difficulty of opening up that home and personal space to have people come in. Yeah. Russ just made an interesting observation. So while I don't believe I'm autistic, most of my nephews are. I think differently to most people. I think in pictures, sometimes I struggle to communicate what I'm thinking. Yeah, so this is an example of going with the way your brain works instead of fighting it. I've done a lot of writing over the years. I find that, and I don't think I'm a bad writer. I think I'm actually okay at it. Well, I've had 4 books published, so I suppose that's saying something. But I often don't think in terms of words. I think in a much more amorphous way, and probably a more visual way. It's more a case of, if I'm thinking through something, it's not so much with my eyes open looking, it's more like, okay, close my eyes, visualize this, I've got this and this over here, and this is how these things relate to each other. Now, I might do that with my eyes open while I'm talking to someone, but I will kind of visually zone out from the conversation and be hearing, but my head is actually seeing something else. Now, this manifests itself in an interesting way when I'm driving. So very early, in fact, late in my school years, I went and did a screening test. This is when I was trying to figure out what I was going to study at uni. I went and did a screening to get into the military academy in Canberra for the Air Force. And so I went through the whole process, the screening process. I didn't end up going. But they did all the usual things, the aptitude tests and IQ tests and psychological profiling and those sorts of things. But one of the things that was interesting is that I scored incredibly highly on an understanding of 3D structures and their relationships. So there are all sorts of, the classic tests where they will show you a representation on paper of a couple of sides of an object, and you have to infer the other side of the object or the relationship between symbols in different orientations. And my scores on that sort of testing were way up there. Dealing with 3-dimensional structures and multiple objects, I can hold those objects in my brain and manipulate them and see them from different points of view and understand the relationships between those objects extremely well. And so I'm chasing a squirrel right now. Just proving the whole point. A squirrel brought up from the chat. So what happens is that when I'm driving, I have this mental model in my head of everything going on around me. Like, I know where every car is in my vicinity. It might not be in my field of view right now, but I know that there was a particular car that was a lane across in the left and it was approaching at a certain rate. And therefore I know that it is over there, like I'm looking over that way. I know the car is there and I know how it is passing my own vehicle because I've got this mental model in my head of everything and the relationship around it. Now this ties into the house of cards and context switching that I was talking about way back near the start of the stream. And so this is one of the areas where this is the classic thing. If I am driving a car and I have this mental model of all of the moving objects around me, and I'm plotting them all in my head and understanding their relative velocities and all of that sort of thing, all the vector calculations, and I'm talking to someone, I can talk to someone about many different things. But if they ask me to visualize something, then that impinges my ability to maintain the structure of everything around me. So if they want me, for example, to describe something or to visualize something in relation to something else, then that is a problem for maintaining the rest of the spatial relationships in my head between all of those other objects. And so it's kind of like my brain switches from maintaining one set of structures in its head and the relationship between those objects and a different set of structures, and it's like I momentarily become, no, this is overstating it, but it's kind of like becoming temporarily blind while driving. It is where the system in the cerebellum that is highly optimized to doing this one task and is really, really good at it is suddenly switched over to doing a different task. And so now the task of driving, instead of being on that highly optimized, very well trained autopilot, and the routines that have been burned into the cerebellum are now being done by the much less efficient conscious mind, and I'm thinking about it instead of simply allowing the subsystem to do what it does best of maintaining the understanding of all of the relationships of the moving and stationary objects around me. Anyway, right, where am I at? You said I'd take an Uber. Yeah. Yeah, Pancake said, lol, back to looking at faces while visualizing physical things. Yeah. Yes. So, where are we? We're almost spot on 2 hours. Hang on, I need a drink because I'm getting a bit hoarse after all of this talking. Mitchell's in Peter mode. 4 minutes left. Yes, thank you. Oh, and Chip said, I utilize this technique especially when reversing a large articulating lorry. Yeah. So last week, Chip and I were talking about reversing trucks, and he was describing the process of reversing a road train. So I don't know if they're a particularly Australian thing, but or how common they are in other parts of the world. But in Australia, there are things called road trains, which is typically a truck. It's a truck that consists of the prime mover or the tractor and four what's this? 4 trailers behind it. It's like a B double. So you typically have like 2 large trailers, 2 small trailers, and they could be 100 and something tons, and they're ridiculously long. So imagine the difficulty of driving a car with a trailer. Now imagine a car with 4 trailers behind it, all hooked together like a snake, and driving forward, it's okay, the snake will kind of follow you. Now imagine trying to reverse that with 4 trailers all stuck together. Now imagine trying to reverse that when it's 100 plus tons and and the back of it is way, way, way back down the road behind you. Well, the people that drive road trains sometimes have to reverse them. That is not a job that I would ever want to have to do. That is just ridiculous. So hats off to Chip, who is qualified to drive road trains. Ridiculous. Yeah, so, Jack's Tech said they only exist in Australia. That's interesting. Okay. I suppose just because we've got such big distances to travel. And Jack's Tech said, aren't road legal basically anywhere else? It's a double B double. Yeah, so a B double is a semi-trailer with 2 trailers on it. And it's like a double semi-trailer. Yeah. Joel said, try reversing an airplane. Yes. Okay. So I am going to wrap this up soon, but there is a comment from Ecognito3. Ecognito said, if you're okay to discuss, 1, what does your wife think of all this? And 2, how has your life improved since you've started down this exploration? So the first question, I don't want to get into that too much, but the second, how has your life improved since you started down this exploration? It is very early in the process of my understanding of this. So the things that I've been talking about today is just scratching the surface of understanding ADHD and neurodivergence in general. pretty much everything I've talked about today are things that I've just picked up in the last 2 weeks, essentially. It's just, little snippets of information here and there as I've been looking into it and just trying to understand what's going on in my own head and why I think about things in certain ways and why I behave in certain ways. There is so much more to learn and to understand about it. I think, so the thing I really want to address here is how my life has improved. It's too early for my life in terms of my circumstances, the bigger picture, to have improved. But what has improved, I think, is my own acceptance of myself and my mental state. It has, to some extent, allowed me to relax about myself and about the way I do things. Now, there is a distinction to be made here. This is not an excuse, and I am very conscious of that. But what it means is that I can look at my own behaviors or habits and realize that there may be a reason for it and that I can relax about it. It's not necessarily something I have to fight. I don't necessarily have to think, I've got to stop doing that because that behavior is not socially acceptable, or I am broken in some way and I need to fix myself. Which is kind of how I've thought about myself over the years. What I can do now is, it's a little bit like that thing I was referencing with masking. I can relax about it and go, there is a reason for having certain tendencies, or realizing that I have strengths in certain areas and therefore play to those strengths, work around the weaknesses and accept the weaknesses. So I don't see it as something that has to be fixed. It is not that my brain is broken. It's not that there is anything wrong with me as such. It's a matter of accepting that the way my brain works and the accommodations that I've made, the adjustments that I've made over the years to provide scaffolding for my brain in terms of work environment and the way I relate to people and social interactions and all of those sorts of things. There is now a context in which I can understand it. And instead of trying to put all of those things in place in isolation and come up with all of the workarounds myself, I've realized that there are so many other people who are doing the same thing. They're putting in place similar workarounds and facing the same sorts of challenges in life. And we can talk about it, which is fantastic. I can hang around with people who allow me to drop that mask and relax and to be myself and to enjoy life, and who will accept that I do things in a slightly unusual way, maybe, but that's fine. And yeah. So I think, yeah, it is all about understanding myself. And I'm sure there will be many other benefits. I think one of the, so the converse to that and the reaction that I think many people have is, with many people, I'm making big generalizations here. What's new? With many people, if you approach them and said, hey, you have ADHD, their reaction is going to be, my brain is broken, I've got to fix it. My reaction is more like, wow, that's fascinating. Now I understand more about my brain. And that's fine. It's not, maybe there are things I'll have to adjust. It'll be very interesting to see what happens as I go through the diagnostic process, and whether there are certain things like particular treatments that I should undertake, whether there are benefits to those treatments. I don't necessarily want to change myself. It's not, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with myself. It's just, this is the way I am. Now that I can learn a little bit more about it, I can approach things in a measured way and an understanding. And now when things happen, like I have the impulse to undertake some behavior that in the past other people externally would say, oh, that's really risky behavior, and I don't see it as risky now, I might recognize it and see that, hey, I am undertaking this behavior, or I have the urge to do this thing because I am deficient in oxytocin and I'm wanting that stimulation or the excitement or whatever it is that I get from that activity. And I'm not just doing it unknowingly. I'm realizing that I'm doing things for a reason. So, yeah. Dodgy said, treatment is not a good word. Yeah. Yeah, okay, I've been ignoring the chat again. Many people saying the same thing. Treatment is not changing, it's supporting. If it changes you, it's not the right treatment. Dodgy said, treatment is not a good word. Yeah, okay. That is, you're absolutely right. Treatment is not a good word. But there are certain characteristics that may be problematic and that require adjustment, either through medication or through changes, like conscious changes in behavior or certain exercises. Those exercises could be either physical, working the cerebellum and strengthening those neural pathways, or those exercises could be practical, or they could be mental. So it's a matter of understanding that I work in a certain way, I have a predisposition to behave or do things in a certain way, so let's not fight that where there's no problem with it, and let's support it or work around it or provide accommodations in areas where it could be problematic. So, yes. I am... That's funny. Jack's text said, thanks for the docs of oxytocin. All right. Incognito provided a quote, there is nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self. Ernest Hemingway. Right. Cool. There are some interesting things just coming up in the chat. Stephen W. said, thoughts on alcohol? I dislike it as it takes away control. Interesting. I don't have a lot of thoughts on alcohol. So alcohol is something that I have never had a particular problem with. I generally don't drink, and it's not because I have anything against alcohol. Like I'm not a teetotaler. Like I don't not drink at all, but my drinking is essentially a few times a year. It's like, okay, I'm at a wedding and I'll have a glass of champagne. Or rarely it'll be, oh, like that's a really nice cider. I'll drink a bottle of that, I'll drink some of that with a burger because it happens to go well together. But it's rare. I will go months without having any alcohol at all. And it's just never been a problem for me in terms of it. It's just never been a desire. It's like I just don't care. So, but in a more general sense, what I was alluding to earlier is things like substance abuse is definitely a problem for many people with ADHD. I think partly because of the it's such a complex subject. Things like anxiety coming along as a co-occurrence with ADHD, and the anxiety might be originating in things like the stress of masking and hiding yourself and not being able to relax and exist in society as yourself. So many different aspects to this. And then from that, it can lead to issues of substance abuse. So it is a very common and totally understandable result of being in these sorts of circumstances. I just saw Mitchell say, I'm a drunk hugger. Yeah, I'm a very tactile and physically affectionate person. And so, which is another aspect to all of this as well. Anyway, yeah, Yoz said trauma is the gateway to addiction. Yep. Ecognito said group hug. Yes, I am naturally a very physically affectionate person. It's just the way I am, and it's once, yeah. Anyway. Yes, group hug. All right. So, I think it is probably about time to wrap this up. Dodgy says, steps back from all your weirdos. Keep your distance. Sion says, I've never given him a hug. Oh, I'm sorry, Sion. I owe you a hug. Yeah, Yoz said, please reach out anytime. Thank you, Yoz. I appreciate that. All right. Where are we? Well, we're at nearly 12:15, so I am a little bit over time today. And Gerald said, thanks, John. That was interesting and brave. Best wishes as you go through this process. Take care, everybody. Yeah. Thanks for that, Gerald. I appreciate it, and I appreciate all of you coming along. This sort of thing, I tend to be very open on my live streams. I talk about what is on my mind and chase the squirrels, and it is a place that I feel like I can be quite open. There are certain things that I don't talk about. Mostly the things that I don't talk about are when they impact other people or when they involve other people, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot or make them or reveal things that they're uncomfortable about. So I try to be very circumspect about that. Yoz said, please read the chat later. Yes, I think I should. I have read only a tiny percentage of all the chat that has gone past. So thank you very much for participating in this. And like all of these live streams, it might be me sitting here talking to you, but this really is a bi-directional thing, and I do appreciate the interaction. I don't think I could just sit here for 2 hours straight and talk about something if it wasn't for the fact that I'm getting all of this interaction and all of the feedback and everybody else's perspectives on things as well. And thank you to the people that have revealed their own personal situations as well, and nobody should ever feel like that is expected or they're obliged, but it does help with knowing that there are other people out there who are going through similar situations and facing similar challenges, and we're not alone. So I thank you very much, everyone, for being part of this. And I am going to go now. Have a fantastic Sunday afternoon. And maybe by next week I will have my my camera switching stuff set up so that we can do an assembly session, a total change of gear, and look at some electronics under the microscope, which I love to do. So thank you very much. I'm going to hit the button now and then grab a drink. and I will see you all on the flip side. Oh, go and build something awesome.